Have you ever felt like someone is slowly pulling away from you right when you start getting closer to them? Like one moment they are warm, present, and interested, and the next moment they feel distant, cold, or emotionally unavailable, leaving you confused, overthinking, and trying to figure out what went wrong? If this has ever happened to you, you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not crazy for feeling this way. There is a deep psychological pattern behind this kind of behavior, and once you understand it, everything starts to make sense in a way it never did before. But here is the truth most people never hear. It is not just about bad communication. It is not just about mixed signals. And it is definitely not just about someone not caring enough. What you are dealing with is something much deeper, something rooted in emotional wiring, past experiences, and subconscious protection mechanisms that people don't even fully understand about themselves. And when you don't understand this, you start making one very painful mistake. You start chasing harder. You start trying to fix the distance. You start overthinking every message, every silence, every change in tone, because your mind believes one simple thing. If I just do something right, they will come back to how they were. But in reality, the more you try to pull someone closer who is emotionally stepping back, the more they feel overwhelmed inside. Not because they do not feel anything, but because closeness itself feels different to them. There is a certain type of person who experiences emotional intimacy in a very unique way. When things are light and distant, they feel okay. They feel in control. They feel safe. But when connection becomes deeper, when emotional closeness starts to build, something inside them quietly shifts. It is not a conscious decision. It is not something they plan. It happens automatically, like a protective system turning on inside their mind and body. Suddenly, what once felt good starts to feel heavy. What once felt safe starts to feel restricting. And what once felt like love starts to feel like pressure. So they do what their system has learned to do over time. They pull back. They create space. They become less available. And from your side, it feels confusing, even painful, because you are giving more, trying more, caring more, and yet receiving less in return. This is where most people get stuck in emotional loops that drain them completely. They start questioning their worth. They start wondering if they did something wrong. They start analyzing every detail, trying to find the moment things changed. But the real shift did not come from something you did in that exact moment. It came from a deeper internal trigger inside them, something tied to how their mind processes emotional closeness, independence, and vulnerability. And here's what makes this even more important to understand. This pattern is not about you being not enough, and it is not about them being bad at love. It is about two different emotional systems trying to connect without understanding each other. One system moves toward closeness for safety. The other system moves away from closeness for safety. And when these two patterns collide, confusion is created on both sides. But here is where everything begins to change for you. Because once you understand what is actually happening beneath the surface, you stop reacting emotionally and start seeing clearly. You stop chasing blindly. You stop panicking over distance. And you stop mistaking emotional withdrawal for rejection. Instead, you start recognizing patterns. You start noticing timing. You start understanding emotional pacing. And that awareness alone can completely change the way you experience relationships. But this is only the beginning. Because what you are about to understand next will challenge everything you thought you knew about love, attraction, and emotional connection. You will see why some people pull away exactly when things start feeling real. You will understand what actually creates emotional safety for someone who fears closeness. And most importantly, you will learn why the way most people try to fix this situation actually makes it worse without them realizing it. So before you move forward, understand this clearly. If you have ever felt like you were too much for someone who once seemed interested, or if you have ever felt like you had to shrink yourself just to keep someone close, there is a reason for that feeling. And it is not the reason you think. Stay with this. Because by the end, you will not only understand their behavior better, you will also understand your own emotional patterns in a completely new way. And that understanding changes everything. Now that you can see how emotional distance and closeness can trigger completely different internal reactions, there is a deeper layer you need to understand before anything else starts to truly change in your mind. because most of the confusion people experience in these situations does not come only from the other person's behavior. It comes from something happening inside your own thinking pattern. A silent assumption starts forming without notice. An assumption that says, if you find the right words, the right timing, the right level of effort, you can guide the outcome. This is where the illusion begins. The illusion that love can be managed through control, not control in an obvious way, but subtle control. Emotional adjustments, strategic behavior, careful messaging, waiting for the right moment, pulling back slightly to create interest, moving forward again to regain connection. It feels like strategy, but underneath it is something much more emotional. It is the mind trying to reduce uncertainty, because uncertainty is uncomfortable for the human brain. When outcomes feel unclear, the mind looks for patterns it can influence. It tries to create predictability where none exists yet, and in emotional situations, this becomes even stronger. When someone's attention shifts without warning, the brain starts scanning for reasons. It tries to regain stability by figuring out what action will bring things back to how they were. This is where people often fall into repeated cycles without realizing it. A message is sent, then another, then a pause, then waiting, then checking behavior changes, then analyzing tone, then adjusting communication style, then trying again. Not because of logic, but because the nervous system is searching for relief. There is a psychological principle that explains this clearly. When rewards are inconsistent, the brain becomes more focused on them, not less. So when affection or attention is unpredictable, it creates a stronger mental fixation. The mind becomes attached to figuring out the pattern even more than enjoying the connection itself. This is why emotional inconsistency can feel strangely addictive. Not because it is healthy, but because the brain is trying to solve an unsolved equation. And in that process, something important gets lost. Self-awareness becomes replaced with reaction. Instead of observing the situation calmly, the mind starts adjusting behavior based on immediate emotional discomfort. A delay in response feels like a signal. A shorter message feels like meaning. A change in tone feels like danger. But in reality, most of these signals are not clear indicators of anything concrete. They are interpreted through emotional pressure, not objective truth. This is where control begins to feel necessary, because if meaning can be extracted from every small change, then maybe the outcome can be influenced. But emotional connection does not operate like a machine with predictable inputs and outputs. People are not systems that respond consistently to specific actions. They are complex emotional environments shaped by history, stress, comfort, fear, and personal boundaries. When you try to manage that complexity through behavior adjustments, the effort becomes exhausting, because there is no final point where everything feels secured, only temporary relief, followed by more uncertainty. And that creates a loop, acting to gain reassurance, feeling temporary calm, then noticing new uncertainty again, then adjusting once more. Over time, this cycle weakens emotional stability, not because something is wrong with the situation itself, but because the mind is placed in a constant state of evaluation. There is another layer to this pattern that is often missed. The more effort is used to influence someone's availability, the more the emotional weight shifts away from genuine connection and toward outcome management. In other words, the focus slowly moves from understanding the person to changing the situation. And that shift changes everything internally, because understanding creates clarity, but trying to manage outcomes creates pressure. And pressure changes behavior in a way that rarely leads to natural emotional bonding. At a deeper level, what is really being sought is not control over another person. It is control over emotional uncertainty. The desire to know where things stand, the desire to stop guessing, the desire to feel secure again. These are human needs. They are not wrong. But the way they are pursued often creates the opposite result. Instead of stability, more instability appears. Instead of closeness, more distance can form, and this is where a critical realization begins to emerge. Influence in relationships does not come from tightening control. It comes from reducing internal urgency. When urgency is high, communication becomes heavy. Expectations rise without being spoken. Subtle pressure enters interactions without intention. And that pressure is often felt even when nothing direct is said. So the real shift is not about finding better strategies. It is about noticing when the mind is trying to take over the experience. Because the mind believes that if it analyzes enough, it can secure certainty. But emotional connection is not built through certainty first. It is built through stability, space, and consistent emotional presence over time. And ironically, the attempt to force certainty often delays the very stability being searched for. Once this becomes clear, something starts to change internally. Reactions slow down. Interpretation becomes less immediate. Space between trigger and response begins to grow. And in that space, clarity starts to return. Not the clarity of controlling someone's behavior, but the clarity of seeing the situation without emotional distortion. This is where the foundation for healthier connection begins to form. Because when the illusion of control weakens, a different kind of strength starts to appear. A steadier presence, a calmer awareness, a reduced need to force outcomes. And from that place, the dynamic begins to shift in a way that feels less chaotic and more grounded. But to understand why this shift is so powerful, there is another layer that needs to be uncovered next. When that internal urgency starts to quiet down, something very important becomes visible for the first time. You begin to notice that not every shift in someone's behavior carries the meaning you once attached to it. What used to feel like rejection starts to feel less certain. What used to feel like a sign becomes less dramatic in your mind. And this change is not about ignoring reality. It is about removing emotional distortion from perception. Because when emotions are high, the mind does not observe, it interprets. And those interpretations are often shaped by fear rather than truth. This is where a new understanding starts forming. Human connection is not built on constant intensity. It is built on emotional regulation between two people. When one person becomes overwhelmed internally, they naturally seek distance to restore balance. When another person feels that distance, they often increase intensity to restore closeness. This creates a push and pull dynamic that feels confusing, but it is actually predictable once you understand the pattern. One side seeks relief through space. The other seeks relief through closeness. Neither side is trying to create harm. Both are trying to stabilize their internal state. But when these two responses happen at the same time, the connection becomes unstable. Because every action designed to create comfort for one person can unintentionally create discomfort for the other. This is where misunderstandings grow. What feels like care from one side can feel like pressure from the other. What feels like space from one side can feel like abandonment from the other. And without awareness, both people start reacting to the surface behavior instead of understanding the internal experience behind it. At this stage, many people make a silent assumption. They believe that if they express themselves more clearly or behave in a more correct way, the other person will naturally align with them. But emotional alignment does not happen through correction. It happens through nervous system safety. When someone feels emotionally safe, their system does not interpret connection as a threat. They do not feel the need to step back to regain balance. But safety is not created through intensity or urgency. It is created through steadiness. Steadiness in communication, steadiness in emotional tone, steadiness in presence over time. This is often misunderstood because it appears simple, but it requires deep internal control. Because the hardest part is not how the other person responds. The hardest part is resisting the urge to react immediately when uncertainty appears. Most people are conditioned to respond instantly to emotional discomfort. A delayed message creates anxiety. A change in tone creates questions. A shorter reply creates doubt, and the instinct is to act quickly to fix that discomfort. But quick emotional action often comes from anxiety, not clarity. And anxiety-driven behavior rarely produces stable outcomes. Instead, it increases emotional noise in the interaction. Over time, that noise makes the connection harder to read for both sides. So what actually builds stability is not faster response, but slower reaction. A moment of pause between feeling and response creates space for interpretation to become more accurate. In that space, something powerful happens. The situation stops being defined by immediate emotion and starts being understood through patterns instead. Patterns of consistency, patterns of timing, patterns of effort, patterns of emotional availability. This shift from reaction to observation is one of the most important changes in emotional intelligence because it removes the pressure from every single interaction. Instead of treating each moment as a final verdict, you begin to see it as part of a larger sequence, and sequences are far easier to understand than isolated moments. Another important realization appears here. Emotional availability is not a fixed trait in most people. It fluctuates depending on internal stress, external responsibilities, and personal capacity. So when someone withdraws, it is not always a permanent statement about the relationship. It can simply be a reflection of internal overload, but when this is not understood, withdrawal is often interpreted as loss, and that interpretation creates emotional escalation from the other side, which then increases the very distance that was feared in the first place. This cycle repeats because both sides are responding to immediate emotional signals instead of underlying emotional states. Breaking this cycle does not require changing the other person. It requires changing the way responses are formed internally. When emotional stability increases within you, the need to interpret every shift decreases. And when interpretation decreases, pressure also decreases. And when pressure decreases, communication begins to feel lighter again. This is where a subtle but powerful transformation begins. Instead of trying to force clarity, you start allowing clarity to develop naturally over time. Instead of trying to secure certainty in the moment, you begin to accept that emotional certainty is something that forms through consistency, not control. And instead of reacting to every change, you start observing whether the overall direction of behavior is stable or unstable. This broader perspective reduces emotional exhaustion significantly because attention is no longer trapped in micro-level fluctuations. It is placed on long-term emotional behavior, and this is where real understanding begins to develop, not through emotional intensity, but through calm observation and internal regulation. Once this level of awareness becomes stronger, the entire experience of connection begins to feel different, less chaotic, less reactive, more grounded. And from here, a new layer of understanding naturally becomes important, because emotional patterns alone do not explain everything that happens next in these dynamics. When observation becomes stronger than reaction, something subtle begins to shift inside your emotional world. You no longer experience every change in someone's behavior as an emergency that requires immediate interpretation. Instead, there is a growing ability to hold uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. This is not emotional detachment. It is emotional maturity forming in real time. And from this state, you start noticing something important that was invisible before. Not all distance means disconnection. Not all silence means loss. Not all inconsistency means lack of care. These meanings were once automatic. Now they begin to slow down before forming. And in that slowing down, clarity enters, because the mind is no longer filling gaps instantly with fear-based conclusions. Instead, it starts waiting for patterns to reveal themselves over time. This changes the entire emotional experience of connection. Where there was once tension, there is now space for understanding. But this new space brings responsibility with it, because when emotional urgency fades, you can no longer rely on intensity to guide decisions. You must rely on consistency. And consistency is something that can only be recognized through time and attention. This is where many people begin to notice a deeper truth about relationships. What sustains emotional bonding is not peak moments of connection. It is the regularity of stable interaction, not dramatic highs, not dramatic lows, but a steady emotional rhythm that both people can trust. When that rhythm is missing, uncertainty increases. And when uncertainty increases, the mind begins to search for control again. So even after progress in awareness, there can still be moments where old patterns try to return, moments where waiting feels uncomfortable again, moments where silence feels louder than it is, moments where interpretation begins to rise without evidence. This is normal. Because emotional conditioning does not disappear instantly, it weakens gradually through repetition of new responses. Each time you choose not to react immediately, you weaken the automatic cycle. Each time you allow space before responding, you strengthen internal stability. Over time, this builds a new default way of experiencing connection. And in this new state, something very different becomes possible. You begin to see that emotional connection is not maintained by constant action. It is maintained by reliability. Reliability does not require intensity. It requires presence that does not fluctuate drastically. When presence is stable, the nervous system of both people begins to settle. But when presence is unpredictable, even small interactions can feel charged. This is why some connections feel exhausting even when nothing major is happening. The emotional system is constantly adjusting to uncertainty, and the mind interprets that adjustment as stress. Once this is understood, the focus naturally shifts again, not toward changing the other person, but toward understanding the environment created between both people. Because relationships are not just about individuals, they are about interaction patterns. And interaction patterns either create safety or tension over time. When safety is present, communication becomes easier without effort. When tension is present, even simple exchanges feel complicated. This is why awareness of patterns becomes more valuable than focusing on isolated events. A single moment cannot define emotional direction, but repeated behavior can. And once you start viewing connection through repetition instead of reaction, emotional clarity becomes stronger. Another important realization emerges here. Sometimes, what appears as emotional distance is actually a form of self-regulation in the other person. They are not always making a statement about you. They are often managing their own internal state. But when that behavior is viewed through personal insecurity, it becomes misinterpreted. And misinterpretation leads to emotional escalation. Escalation leads to pressure. Pressure leads to withdrawal. Withdrawal leads to more interpretation. This loop can continue unless awareness interrupts it. And awareness does not mean controlling the outcome. It means changing the internal response to uncertainty. When uncertainty no longer triggers immediate emotional action, the loop weakens. And in that weakening, something new appears. Space for natural behavior to unfold without distortion. In that space, it becomes easier to notice genuine consistency versus temporary fluctuation. It also becomes easier to recognize when emotional availability is present versus when it is limited. This distinction is important because it prevents unnecessary emotional investment in unstable patterns, and it also prevents premature conclusions about stable ones. With clearer perception, emotional decisions become more grounded, not driven by fear, not driven by urgency, but guided by observation over time. This shift gradually reduces emotional exhaustion because energy is no longer spent on constant analysis of every interaction. Instead, attention is reserved for meaningful patterns. And meaningful patterns take shape slowly. As this understanding deepens, another layer becomes visible. Emotional stability within yourself directly affects the stability of the connection, not by changing the other person, but by changing the pressure you bring into the interaction. When internal pressure decreases, communication becomes lighter. When communication becomes lighter, interaction feels safer. When interaction feels safer, distance reduces naturally over time. This is not manipulation. It is emotional regulation creating healthier conditions. And when conditions improve, responses often improve as a side effect, not a forced result. But even with this understanding, there is still one deeper psychological layer that explains why some connections shift direction entirely and why others stabilize unexpectedly over time. When emotional pressure inside begins to decrease, something very subtle but powerful starts to surface in the interaction between two people. You begin to notice that responses from the other side are not as random as they once seemed. There is a structure hidden underneath the surface behavior. Not a perfect structure, not a predictable one, but a pattern that becomes clearer when your mind is no longer clouded by urgency. This is where perception starts to sharpen. And with sharper perception, you begin to understand something that changes everything. People do not respond only to what is said. They respond heavily to what they feel during interaction. Not just words, not just actions, but the emotional atmosphere created in the exchange. This atmosphere is shaped by tone, timing, expectation, and internal emotional state. When the atmosphere feels light and unpressured, engagement tends to flow more naturally. When the atmosphere feels heavy or demanding, even subtle communication can feel overwhelming to the other side. This is not about right or wrong behavior. It is about how human nervous systems interpret emotional environments, and those interpretations are immediate, even before conscious thought begins. This is why two conversations with the same words can produce completely different outcomes depending on emotional context. Once this becomes clear, a deeper realization begins to form. Influence in human connection is not built through intensity, it is built through emotional ease. Ease does not mean lack of care. It means absence of internal demand. When there is no hidden expectation attached to interaction, the other person does not feel pressured to respond in a specific way. And in that absence of pressure, openness becomes more likely. But when expectation is present, even silently, it is often sensed rather than heard. And that sensing creates internal resistance. This is where many connections begin to shift without obvious reasons. Not because of one event, but because of accumulated emotional weight in interaction over time. Every conversation carries emotional residue. If that residue feels supportive and calm, trust builds gradually. If it feels tense or evaluative, distance increases gradually. And because this process is slow, it is often missed until the gap becomes noticeable. At this stage, another important understanding appears. People often believe that emotional closeness is created by increasing effort. But effort alone does not guarantee connection. In some cases, increased effort under emotional tension can actually produce the opposite effect, because effort combined with urgency can be interpreted as pressure instead of care. This creates confusion for many who are genuinely trying to improve the connection. They increase communication frequency, they try to explain more, they attempt to clarify intentions. But if the underlying emotional tone remains anxious, the message can still feel heavy. This is why outcome is not determined only by behavior, but by emotional state behind behavior. Once this is understood, attention naturally shifts inward. Instead of asking what more can be done externally, the focus turns toward internal regulation, because internal regulation changes everything without needing external force. When internal state is calm, communication becomes naturally balanced. Responses are no longer driven by fear of loss or fear of silence. They come from steadiness. And steadiness creates a very different experience for both sides. It removes the sense of urgency from interaction. It allows space for genuine response instead of pressured response. And over time, this space becomes the foundation where trust can rebuild itself. But there's an important nuance here. Calmness is not about suppressing emotion. It is about not letting emotion take control of action immediately. Feelings can exist, awareness can exist, but reaction does not have to be instant. This gap between feeling and action is where emotional intelligence grows. And in that gap, decisions become more aligned with long-term stability instead of short-term relief. As this gap strengthens, something else becomes noticeable. The need to constantly interpret every interaction begins to fade because there is no longer a sense of immediate threat attached to uncertainty. Uncertainty becomes tolerable. And when uncertainty becomes tolerable, emotional freedom increases. This freedom changes the entire experience of connection. It reduces dependency on constant reassurance. It reduces fear of silence. It reduces overanalysis of small changes. And in that reduction, clarity becomes more available. With clarity, perception becomes more accurate. And with accuracy, emotional decisions become more grounded. This is the point where many people begin to see that stability was never something to be forced. It was something to be supported through internal balance. When internal balance is present, interaction becomes less reactive. And when interaction becomes less reactive, the other side often feels less pressured, which naturally creates more space for organic connection. This does not guarantee a specific outcome, but it does change the quality of experience significantly, because instead of emotional chaos, there is emotional steadiness, and steadiness allows real patterns to reveal themselves without distortion. At this stage, it becomes possible to understand whether the connection has genuine potential or whether it was being held together by emotional intensity alone. And that understanding brings a level of clarity that reactive thinking could never provide. But even this is not the final layer. There is still one deeper psychological principle that explains why some emotional bonds stabilize unexpectedly, while others dissolve despite strong effort and intention.